My name is Joe Sackman, and I'm an executive committee member of New York Action Network, Our Revolution. And I'd like to briefly tell you about the organizations that are co-hosting tonight's event. New York Progressive Action Network and Our Revolution have both evolved from the efforts to elect Bernie Sanders in 2016. Bernie Sanders made it his campaign about not me, us, and this philosophy is the foundation of both of our organizations. With the combined experience and political power of dozens of chapters statewide, we are joined in the fight to elect working class progressive candidates and advocate for progressive issues like universal health care, especially the New York Health Act here in New York, Green New Deal, and legislation that puts people over profits. We fight for legislation and policy that works towards a more just and equitable society. And you can find out more about NYPAN at NYPAN.org. That's NYPAN.org. Tonight, NYPAN-Our Revolution will host a panel to discuss the need to end qualified immunity. The doctrine of qualified immunity is a threat to our constitutional rights. It's a hurdle preventing victims from finding justice, and overall, it makes our society less safe. Our panel consists of advocates and legal minds who will provide us with an understanding of qualified immunity and why we must put an end to it here in New York. So I'd like to introduce our panel for tonight. We have Darlene McDay. She's an advocate with the End Qualified Immunity New York campaign and a mother who has been directly impacted by these policies. And we have Robert Quackenbush, civil rights litigator and staff attorney at Prisoners' Rights Project at the Legal Aid Society. And we have Kelly Young, a civil rights campaign coordinator at Vocal New York. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And I'd like to start us off with a question which I'm sure many of us are asking. What is qualified immunity and where does it come from? And anyone on the panel that wants to start off with that, please do.
Sure, I'll take it from here. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks to Vocal and NYPAN for putting this together. Like was mentioned, Robert Quackenbush, staff attorney at the Prisoners' Rights Project at Legal Aid. Thinking about qualified immunity makes me think about the small number of things that Congress has actually done correct. One of the great things to come in the Reconstruction era was this Civil Rights Act called Civil Rights Act of 1871, sometimes called the Ku Klux Klan Act. It was a complete reordering of the federal system to allow individuals to sue when the government violates their constitutional rights. When Congress passed this law, it was really as simple as that. An officer, the government violates your constitutional rights and you want to sue for damages, you would simply just need to file a lawsuit and prove that your constitutional rights were violated. If so, then a jury or judge awards you a certain number of damages. And that's as simple as it was for about the first 70 years of the Civil Rights Act. But then the Civil Rights Act began to be successful in the early 1950s, bleeding into the 1960s. The Civil Rights Act was primarily used or successfully used by Black and brown folks trying to vindicate their federal civil rights. And it was against that backdrop of success under the Civil Rights Act that courts decided to rein in the Civil Rights Act to make it less effective. Congress never changed the law. So to the extent that Congress is supposed to represent the will of the people never weighed in to say, let's rein in the Civil Rights Act. This was a bunch of judges. So this is a judicial backlash to the success of the Civil Rights Act. And this is how it works. So let's step out of the policing context for just 1 minute. Imagine that I'm your neighbor and I break into your home. And you didn't give me permission. I break down your door. Your dog starts barking, and so I shoot your dog. And then the situation's over. Well, my neighbor should be able to can sue me for trespass, for breaking down that door, and for harms associated with killing the dog, and for things like assault. And it's really as simple as that. My neighbor would just have to prove for trespass that I didn't have permission to be there. And for assault, I didn't have permission to touch the dog or harm the dog or scare anyone in the home. It's really as simple as that. Now, if a police officer did that, knocks down your door without a warrant, without permission, and then shoots your dog without cause, you could sue them. You could sue them under the Civil Rights Act. And the first thing you have to do is prove that your constitutional rights are violated. They entered without probable cause. They entered without a warrant. There was no basis to shoot my dog. There was no danger, violation of my Fourth Amendment rights. Even if someone establishes that, qualified immunity sweeps in at the back end and asks a question that Congress never intended to be asked. And the question is, was the person's right that was violated clearly established at the time of the incident? The way this works in practice is that the victim, in addition to proving that their rights were violated, has to also go out and find a case, a lawsuit with extremely similar facts, where an appellate court, usually the Supreme Court, which takes very few cases per year, found that your rights were violated. So basically, you not only have to prove that your rights were violated, you have to prove that someone else's rights were violated in almost an identical way at a previous time. And that case made it all the way up to the Supreme Court, which is a nearly impossible task. Think of another situation where, I break into a car dealership and I steal $225,000. If they wanted to get that back, they could sue me for that money, and there's other ways that they could recover it. But as happened in a California case, when police stole $225,000, they were prosecuted, which is great, but when they were sued, they were granted qualified immunity. There was no doubt that their conduct was wrong. There was no doubt that their conduct was illegal. There was no doubt that their conduct was a violation of the penal law. But because no cops had ever stolen $225,000 before in that jurisdiction in that way, the court awarded them qualified immunity. And that's the violence that this doctrine does day in, day out in kind of less dramatic cases and in extremely dramatic cases. It forces individuals to find a case on point with almost identical facts in your jurisdiction that basically made it to the Supreme Court. So it's putting up a hurdle that, for what it's worth, Congress never intended to be there. And that basically means that your case can be thrown out before you even get to see a jury. Juries do not do qualified immunity. That it's just a thing that a judge does. And when a judge awards qualified immunity, that means that the victim will never get to see their day in court. And by day in court, I mean they will never get to tell their story to a jury. And the jury, which on some level is supposed to represent the community, will never have a chance to weigh in about that violation of the law. And at its base, that's what qualified immunity is, and that's why it's got to go.
Thank you, Robert. I mean, just as somebody who's a layperson, it does sound like it's extremely difficult for anyone who has to come up against this to get justice. So I can see why we would need to get rid of it just by what you said. But I'm going to keep it moving along, unless Kelly or Darlene want to weigh in on that. But this question is going to be for the three of you. What brings you to this work, and why is it important for you to end qualified immunity? Robert, you went first before, so I'm gonna go to Darlene, and then Kelly can come in on that, and then you can. Okay. So Darlene, please.
Hi, thank you, Joe. My name is Darlene McDay. What brings me to this work is my son. My son Dante was 22 years old in 2017. He was in a prison in Buffalo, New York, when I received a phone call from another incarcerated person one morning saying that my son was severely beaten by about 15 officers. And they said that he was beaten so badly and hogtied and thrown down the stairs that his face and head were completely deformed. He had blunt force trauma all over his entire body. And there was an investigation by the OSI, and they determined that the officers did in fact assault my son and falsify documents. Even with that, they were never held accountable for their actions. They did not get any sanctions through the administrative process. They haven't been held criminally responsible. And then I filed a lawsuit in 2020. It took me several years to find an attorney. One reason is qualified immunity. I didn't know it existed at the time, but it is a major hurdle for attorneys to overcome, for victims to overcome. And because of this, attorneys would be reluctant to take some cases. In this particular case, when you're dealing with a case that is either with police or with corrections officers, you don't get a lot of information at all. And with that lack of information, it's very hard to get an attorney to understand that your case is really worth it, right? They have to spend a really long time to litigate these cases. So in my case, I did a lot of work myself, filed many, many FOIL requests. I spent $20,000 to send private investigators to the facility to get documentation from people that were witnesses. And then armed with that, in 2020, I filed a lawsuit once I finally found attorneys. And they filed the papers, and one of the first defenses was qualified immunity. Now, that case is not over yet. We still have a long way to go. We haven't even gotten to the discovery phase yet. And qualified immunity can come up several times in a court, in litigation. So I'm still fighting, but just hearing those words, qualified immunity, learning what it was, it's like a slap in the face to a victim, to a victim's family. Because for me to have to show a case where maybe someone was beaten in exactly the same way is a complete insult. So I'm going to let Kelly take over, but that's my reason. My son is my reason. My son died in 2017 after this beating. And I don't want other families to suffer the way I do. Thank you.
Thank you, Darlene. Thank you for sharing that story. I know you share it often, and I do appreciate you doing that here tonight. So thank you again. Kelly, if you want to.
Yeah. As Joseph mentioned, my name is Kelly Young. I'm the Civil Rights Campaign Coordinator at Vocal New York. Vocal is a grassroots membership-led organization dedicated to building the political power of people who are impacted by mass incarceration, the war on drugs, HIV/AIDS crisis, and homelessness. In my capacity as Civil Rights Campaign Coordinator, I work with our members and leaders who are formerly incarcerated, who are over policed, or who have family members who are incarcerated over policed. And across the board, they have experienced horrors at the hands of police, at the hands of correctional officers, at the hands of, pretty much every government actor. And there are times where they'll just say, I was raped in prison and I did not even file a complaint because I knew that that would bring retaliation upon my head, upon the heads of my family members. There are people who, some of our members who are routinely harassed by police officers in their communities. And it's commonplace, and it is horrific, and it flies in the face of public safety. And it is something that is important for my members and leaders to fight against. And so for that reason, Vocal New York is a part of a grassroots-led coalition of more than 55 local, state, and national organizations fighting to pass a bill to end qualified immunity so that victims and survivors of state violence get that chance at justice and accountability. And ultimately, the goal is to make New York safe for everyone, not just police officers, not just correctional officers, not just people who are wealthy enough to afford attorneys, but everyone, and in particular, those who have suffered centuries of divestment at the hands of this country. And, Robert's introduction of what qualified immunity is really speaks to the really racist history of the doctrine and the ways in which it was used to further, marginalize and demonize Black communities. And so what brings me to this work is protecting Black communities and making sure that we have the laws and practices in place for us to thrive.
Thank you, Kelly. I think that your work is exceptional, and you're doing this, for communities, Black communities. It's also helping everybody. This is, we're in this together. We got to start realizing that we're in this together. And thanks for doing this. So Robert, you want to jump in and tell us what brings you to this?
Sure. So before working at the Legal Aid Society, and still while working at the Legal Aid Society, I represent people who have been victimized by either corrections officers or police officers. And we kind of, it's tempting sometimes to talk about constitutional rights as this kind of high-minded, academic, kind of untouchable thing. Constitutional rights, when those are violated, those are stand-ins for concrete, real physical injuries. The most kind of obvious example and the most commonplace scenario where qualified immunity comes up is in the Fourth Amendment context, police encounters, right? So if things like false arrests, excessive force, things like that. At the back end of those situations, people might have lifelong medical bills. People might have lifelong therapy bills. People might have gone through substantial pain and suffering. They might have lost their job because they spent that weekend in jail or that week in jail or that month in jail. And now they don't have that job and now they've got this mark on their record. And so what qualified immunity does is sweep in to make it impossible for the person to be, to the extent that it's even possible, made whole. It makes it impossible for those lost wages to be paid back, which they deserve. It makes it impossible for them to recover money to pay for their medical bills. And so qualified immunity to me is about eliminating the barrier that lets people get on with their lives. People have these traumatic incidences with the police, and not only do they want to be able to pay their bills, they want closure to be able to move on with their lives, and qualified immunity makes both impossible. So that's where I'm coming from as to the individual clients that I'm serving. But kind of zooming out, taking the bigger picture, I want police and corrections officers to think twice before violating someone's constitutional rights. I want them to think about qualified immunity. I want them to think about being brought into court about the thing that they're about to do, or that they're tempted to do, or that their colleagues do. So in addition to being kind of focused on the individual and trying to help them use the court system to pay their bills and take care of themselves, I want officers on the beat, I want corrections officers, I want government officials kind of across the board to think twice before they take a course of action that violates someone's constitutional rights.
You want them to think ethically, as we all should, right? Yeah, there is a cost, right? That right now there's no cost for them, no accountability with this. And so again, appreciate that this is important. I think the three of you show, what we've got going on here is Darlene directly affected, Kelly showing that within the communities, how this affects the communities overall. And then Robert, bringing in the legality of it and what we need to do to change in that end. And that's how we make change, right? By coming together in this way. So next question I've got is that this is for Kelly, right? So as a civil rights campaign coordinator at Vocal, New York, how will ending qualified immunity bring safety to the communities you work with across New York State?
Thanks. We are in a real interesting place in terms of political narratives where the topic of public safety and community safety is regularly being thrown out there. And we are, I think, being challenged to have a way larger and more expansive understanding of what safety means and what violence means. And to the safety point, it is critical that we understand safety outside of harm, outside of policing, because for the longest time, it's safety has been synonymous with law enforcement. And that is a reality that we know is not true for a lot of people who have been historically over policed. And we also know that the safest communities are not the ones that have the most police or the most jails, but the ones that have the most resources. And then with regard to violence, really having an understanding of violence that is rooted in structural violence, and seeing the ways in which poverty is violence, and food insecurity is violence, homelessness is violence, and all of these things breed more violence. I mean, I think ending qualified immunity is an opportunity to really make that understanding stark. Because right now we're living in a culture of impunity where my members and my leaders have a really firm understanding that they can be raped, they can be killed, they can be abused on the streets, in jails, in their homes, and nothing will be done about it. And that can't exist in a society that we're calling safe. And I think ending qualified immunity gets us to a place where we can start having honest conversations about what safety looks like, and really naming the ways in which police and corrections perpetuate violence in our communities. Because, you know, we're already hearing that, like, you know, well, there's transparency. We're able to see when police officers or correctional officers are violating our rights, but that accountability piece, knowing that something will happen when our community members are targeted, is huge. And one thing I do want to note is that, you know, qualified immunity is a defense all government officials are afforded. So that's not just police and correctional officers. It is really cross-cutting, and it's a defense that's afforded to them at the expense of people who are marginalized, who don't have the resources that they need. And Vocal represents members across the entire state, from New York City, Albany, Rochester, Syracuse, Buffalo, and the stories are shockingly similar. This is not a downstate issue. This is a statewide and even national issue. And our ability to protect our civil rights is shrinking at the federal level. So it is urgent that we act swiftly to get this bill passed in June, so that we can actually have accountability and justice in our state, and really just, you know, start talking about what real safety means. And we were in Albany earlier this week speaking with legislators about it. And I think, you know, being able to be back in Albany and actually sit in the face of our lawmakers and really tell these stories, and really humanize what is going on and what we're actually fighting for is really powerful. And our leaders left really, you know, getting hope that, you know, we can actually get this done, because they care about the culture of impunity that's in prisons and jails across the state, and the humanitarian crisis that has resulted from that. And we know that police violence is gun violence. And those things are not being talked about because there's no accountability, because there's no public understanding of violence that includes police officers and correctional officers and other government actors. But we also know that, you know, there cannot, like, trust is not possible without accountability. And accountability is not possible without ending qualified immunity. And this is not something that, you know, just my members believe, but there are law enforcement organizations across the state who are also making this case. And so we're going to keep fighting for it, because it is critical to actually having a safe communities. And our understanding of community has to extend to people who are in our prisons and jails, and oftentimes it does not.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think an observation I make personally is that we tend to have two justice systems, you know, so it's there's a lot here to go through, and I'm glad that you all are helping us out tonight with learning about this and what we can do. So next question I want to go to is, you know, it kind of goes into this, you know, what are the myths around qualified immunity? And I guess maybe you can say the false narratives that have come up. Darlene, you want to address that for us?
Sure. Thanks, Joe. First we hear these myths about, cops will go bankrupt. If you end qualified immunity, cops will go bankrupt. They'll lose their houses, they'll lose their livelihood. And we know that that's just not true. I mean, even currently, cops are indemnified like 99.8% of time, and cops will be indemnified. So that means that the public entity pays, not the police officer or correction officer or government official themselves. And the bill is written that way as well. And the reason for that is because we want a systemic change. That's first and foremost, we want a systemic change. We don't want to just go after one particular officer and work in silos. We want that change to be systemic. It has to be from the top down. The second reason is so that victims can get their settlement, can get their judgments. If somebody had a judgment against a police officer and it's not paid, what good is that, right? So that's the first one, that they'll go bankrupt, and it's just not true. The second one is generally that there'll be a mass exodus. Cops won't want to, nobody will want to be a police officer anymore, or they'll leave the force in droves, and that is just not true. Colorado ended qualified immunity back in 2020, and they actually did not see an increase of officers leaving the force. And officers that are leaving the force are not leaving the force in any larger numbers than anyone else is leaving any other job. So that's not true. And then the other thing that we sometimes hear is that officers won't be able to do their job. And I'll let Bobby take that one because, that has to do with some legal protections as well.
Sure. So thanks for that introduction. So I mentioned earlier, one of the things that I want officers to do is think twice. And police will sometimes respond to that, say, actually, we need to be able to act quickly, or else, the public's at risk if we're not able to act quickly and rely on our instincts. And we don't want to, for lack of a better term, handcuff ourselves and not be able to respond to fast-moving situations and use our judgments. That's a scarecrow. That's a false herring. That's not an actual real problem. Here's why. The law is, even putting qualified immunity to the side, let's forget about that for a second. The law is already so generous to police officers and corrections officers in making split-second decisions. Just looking at the police context, most of these claims are Fourth Amendment claims, and the term there is unreasonable searches and seizures. And so a reasonable search and seizure doesn't violate the law. Only an unreasonable one does. And where does this come up? It comes up in the split-second decision context. So if an officer makes a reasonable mistake, they are given information that they have every reason to believe about a person about to pull a gun on them. They think that bulge is a gun, and the person reaches for it, and they have got every reason to think it's a gun. And the jury thinks it's a believable reason to think that there's a gun there. Okay, that is the kind of reasonable mistake that the Fourth Amendment, for better or worse, permits officers to make. It allows reasonable mistakes. Also thinking about situations where officers are given bad information. So someone calls the police and says, my neighbor did XYZ to me. The officer relying on that information can make an arrest, even if it later turns out that information that the officer was given was wrong. If the officer had no reason to believe it, or no reason to doubt it, then the Fourth Amendment isn't violated. There's already so much protection given to police officers to make quote unquote reasonable mistakes. But I kind of want to pull back from that just a second. If you remember some of the narratives in the summer of 2020, when there was a stated goal to try to reduce the jail population because of COVID, there was some discussion among police officials, only make necessary arrests. the term necessary arrest was actually a term that they were throwing around in training. It begs the question what these unnecessary arrests were that they've been making this whole time. But society didn't crumble, right, when only necessary arrests were made. And so the idea that that police will be kind of paralyzed and afraid to act, that hasn't been borne out in places that have modified or pulled back the qualified immunity regimes. As was mentioned, public safety has improved, and so there's a lot of myths out there and a lot of straight up scaremongering, and very little of it is grounded in fact. Police will still be able to make arrests. They'll still be able to, when appropriate, when it's needed, whatever that means, use force. They're still going to be able to do that with or without under the Fourth Amendment, because the Fourth Amendment gives them a lot of space to make mistakes.
Great. That kind of went into the next question, which is, if we passed, the bill to end qualified immunity, what would it be like? So maybe you could just give us a really quick, in Darlene's case, qualified immunity is not there. Those hurdles just seem to disappear that she has to keep worrying about. So, if you just give us an idea, like real quick, how it would look,
So right now, under state law, very difficult to sue the state. You've got to move super quickly. You've got to move within 90 days. And sometimes when someone is just had this encounter with the police, they need to wait more than 90 days. Maybe they're in the hospital for 90 days. Maybe they've got an open criminal case and they don't want to make a lawsuit where they have to make statements at the same time they're being prosecuted for the same thing. So this bill, when passed, would allow for a 3-year statute of limitations, just like the federal civil rights statute. It would make attorneys less scared of quote unquote close cases, right? These close cases is where qualified immunity apparently is most active. And so it's going to embolden attorneys to take these cases. Darlene was mentioning how difficult it was for her to find an attorney. If we roll back qualified immunity and do the other things that this bill does, there's going to be an army of attorneys waiting and getting in line and wanting to bring these cases. And that can only help, right? That can only help improve, but make it more likely that someone is going to find a lawyer. And when they find that lawyer, it's going to be more likely that it's a quality lawyer, which can lead to a better result, which hopefully means that the person, the crime victim, has a better chance of leading a quality life, better quality of life going forward. So just from, and I know this is not the perspective to take, from the attorney's perspective, it will make them want to take more of these police cases and more of these corrections cases, which overall means more people will get justice and more people will get compensated for their injuries. And it'll also mean, hopefully, after this deterrent effect of the law kind of sinks down through cop unions and corrections officers unions, hopefully it does what I hope it does, which is to make them think twice.
Kind of like what's happening in New York City. Not to go too far down that rabbit hole, but we heard that the head of the police union, or was the police chief, said, don't do anything that's going to get you in trouble, basically, which they shouldn't, So it definitely sounds like it would bring more justice and more accountability. So let's talk about the momentum of what's going on. And so it's been just about a year, right, since this bill has been introduced. So tell me what's happening, what's going on in Albany, what's going on with our co-sponsors, how things have been moving, and where we want to see. I know we want to see it passed by the end of June. By the end, June session ends earlier this year. Everybody, it's an election year, so they're going to be hopping out of there really fast. So let's hear what's going on up in Albany. Who wants to take that?
Weigh in.
All right.
Like I mentioned, vocal leaders were up in Albany on Tuesday, talking to folks about ending qualified immunity, and it was really exciting. And we got more co-sponsors, which is what we want to be doing, and really building support. And so this week, Assemblymember Eddie Gibbs, who is from Harlem, first formerly convicted person to serve in New York State legislator, signed on. And we also got some co-sponsorship from 2 senators and 2 other assembly members. And I think one thing to just remember that these are not just names on paper, but the folks who are signed on are really true champions of this bill and are coming out to actions and are speaking at press conferences and coming to like town halls such as these. And I think that's a lot of why we have the momentum that we do. The bill sponsors Senator Robert Jackson, an Assembly member Pam Hunter, and they just really, believe in what we're fighting for and are willing to go to bat for it. And it's exciting. And I think it's really just like a shared understanding that we're not here, it's not about punishing officers. It's about preventing violence from happening in the first place. And that is something that we should all get behind. And the folks who are signing on to the bill really do that. And so the bill is still in committee, which means that, we need to get it voted out, but we definitely believe we can get it done this year. And we're really excited to see that happen.
Awesome. I love to hear that. Anyone else have any stories to share about the momentum? Because it's great to have champions. You're right. You can have co-sponsor. And it's like, oh, thank you for co-sponsor. But if they're not in conference talking about it, if they're not bringing it up, if they're not organizing with their fellow legislators, which we see often enough. But, Robert Jackson's a great guy. Love to hear this. Gibbs, I keep hearing Assemblymember Gibbs' name. So, sounds like he's going to do a lot. This is really good. So I'm going to move it on because I realize.
One more thing I did want to note, and I think the beauty of this campaign is that it is grassroots and the folks who are fighting, similar to Darlene, are the people who are impacted by it. And I think we are really, a lot of the momentum is also a testament to Darlene and her advocacy, and also folks who have suffered similarly, and just really creating space for people who are impacted to speak up and to speak out. And that is happening all across the state. And I mean, the stories are horrifying and they should never happen. And they're getting out there and people are being forced to listen. And I think that is making a real difference.
It does. I know all the advocacy that I've been out there, it's a personal story. Why do we need to make this change? Well, because this person's been directly impacted. It's hurt them, it's hurt their family. It's, if we're not doing this, we're not doing right. So yeah, I'm really glad to hear this. All right. So I love to hear about taking action. So what actions can we take right now and going forward? Darlene, you want to tell us what we can do?
Sure. Right now, you can take out your phone and you can text the words go space EndQiNY to 50409. So it's go space EndQiNY, and you're going to text that to 50409. That's going to send a letter to each one of your representatives and let them know that you want this bill passed. Then you can also go to our website, which is endqiny.org, and go to the Take Action page. We make it very easy. There's ways to take action on there. There's other actions on there. We currently have a postcard campaign with Vocal New York. And there's links there that you can send a postcard about things that have happened either to you or a loved one, or maybe someone you know, or maybe even you don't know anyone that's been affected by violence, by police violence, by corrections violence. And you can send a postcard and we will deliver it to the legislators when we go to Albany. We also have a sign-on letter there. If you're part of an organization, find out if your organization is willing to sign on to the letter. We would love a letter of support. We have so much support. I mean, Vocal has been an unbelievable champion in this fight. Also, Every Time for Gun Safety, Moms Demand Action, There are so many different organizations. As Kelly said, over 50 organizations signed on to the letter, and you know, they're really champions for this. And there's also actions that we're going to have. So our next action is May 4th, and that's a Mother's Day action. We're centering that around affected families, mothers. We're bringing them to Albany to tell their story. You know, I just have to say myself, as a person that's been directly affected by this, that still grieves. I mean, I'll grieve for the rest of my life. I will grieve my son. And I have found so much support in this community. You know, I found so much love and support. And as Kelly said, NYPAN-Our is a grassroots organization. We are not, we're not an organization that's, making money or anything like that. It's totally grassroots. It's all volunteers. And we are able to get people involved and people to stick with us and be champions because they truly believe in this and they truly support us. And it is so amazing to feel that. So definitely, get involved. We want to see everyone out there, and, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Darlene. That's I just texted, and Resist Bot's telling me this bot is on fire. I gotta wait. That's a good sign. That means at least a couple of us on the call tonight are taking direct action. All right. So yeah, there's a lot to do. And we'll have a follow-up email about the actions and everything. And if anyone is an organization that wants to sign on to the organizational letter, we'll share it out. I love sharing that stuff. So
yeah. I just want to add too, Joe, because I see Tamara Carter is on here. I just saw a message, and her son Brandon was one of the people that died in Rikers Island, and Tamara, we've become friends through this, and I offer my support all the time to anyone that's affected. I know how it is. It helps me to help people. That's one of the things, I guess, that makes me feel a little better, to feel like I can help someone, and, I know that this is extremely, extremely difficult to navigate, extremely difficult to deal with. And, I just want to uplift Brandon's name. Also, I've been speaking to Nancy Maldonado, who's the mother of Jonathan Maldonado, who died in Greenberg. And, I just want to uplift all of those people that have lost their lives. And it means so much for this fight. So thank you.
Thank you, Darlene. Thank you for everyone who's come out tonight. It's, again, Kelly said, it's the personal stories. Why are we here? Why are we doing this? It's because of what's happened to you, what's happening to the community. This is something we just have to do. That's why I think we keep coming back to these things. These things we have to do. We can't just go home and hit, watch Disney Plus. We gotta get out there. So thank you. So I'm gonna also recommend additional action. Tweet this. Get it out there. Tweet to the 50409 and NYPAN New York. All right. Tweet that out. Let's get that out there. Share it on your social media. I know I'll do that tonight as well. Make sure it gets out there, and we'll get some more letters. I know my assembly members is gonna love hearing from me. So, let's get some Q&A in. If anyone's got any question, please post it in the chat, and we'll read it to the panelists. And we appreciate any of your questions or your interests. So please do that. Give it a second or two before we move forward. Again, thanks again, Robert and Kelly and Darlene. Education is a big part of how we move things forward. And I hope this will help a lot of people understand what, qualified immunity is and why we need to end it. So it's sometimes legal stuff is hard to wrap your mind around, So we got a question
It
from
should.
Lex. So how much support is there? I guess expand upon, I guess, legislatively, I guess how many senators or assembly people are in on this now? Do you have a number?
Yeah, so in the assembly, I think we're up to 38 co-sponsors. Oh, Katerina just put it in the chat, 40 co-sponsors in the assembly. It got a little confusing because we got 5 new co-sponsors this week. Just this week alone, we got 5 new co-sponsors. So it's been amazing. And then what did I see? 22 in the Senate.
Yeah.
Yep, 22 in the Senate. And also, Brian Benjamin was a co-sponsor when he was a senator. He's, now the lieutenant governor. So, that's great. We have a friend in the executive, right? So, we're working all the ways that we need to make sure that this passes this year. So yeah, we definitely have a lot of momentum behind it, but it takes people to continue to stay involved.
Yeah, it does, definitely does. So we got a question from Susan. Do you think that QI will end anytime soon? I guess we could say the New York State. I don't know about nationally, but at least New York State.
So I was gonna briefly touch on both of those. So we could, whatever that meme is of the skeleton sitting on the bench, that would be us waiting for Congress, right, to sweep in and do something. They could do it, but I think we need to kind of move on to option B. And some states are doing that by passing their own laws, and that's what we're trying to do, is create a New York State version of the federal civil rights bill. But instead of taking all those bad parts of the federal civil rights bill, the state bill would just leave those behind. So all of the good parts of the federal civil rights bill, but leave behind qualified immunity because it's not part of the state bill. Make it easier to sue municipalities and counties and states, because it's very difficult under federal law right now. So there's a lot of reasons to be hopeful here. It's starting to percolate up in different state houses, and sometimes, every once in a while, Congress will take inspiration from the states. But even if Congress doesn't do that, right, we can take care of ourselves. We can pass our own law. We can enforce our own constitution, the state constitution. We don't need to rely on federal courts and what they think about the federal constitution, because that is reaching the bottom. We can do better, and that's what this bill is about. It's about letting states do better, and some states have already taken that path, and hopefully we're right behind them.
All right, cool. I think there was a question. I think you saw that from Neil. Like, what other states were? And I think Darlene had mentioned Colorado had ended qualified immunity. Has anyone else been bold enough to?
So Colorado ended qualified immunity back in 2020. Also, New Mexico ended qualified immunity. There was some version, I believe, California didn't end qualified immunity, but there was some version of it. And also in Connecticut. There are several states currently trying to get legislation passed or drafting legislation to end qualified immunity, including Ohio, I believe Maryland, Vermont is a big one. But I must say that the New York bill is the most comprehensive bill. Those other states that passed qualified immunity passed it only for police officers. So it does not include correctional officers. It does not include any other government officials, which is very, very important, obviously. It's not just police officers. Right.
Yeah, I think that's our first thought. It's the police, corrections officer, etc. That we're interested in, but this is our legislators. These are other governmental officials. If they do something wrong, they shouldn't get away with it because they got qualified immunity. Again, I think I said it earlier, we have more than one justice system, and that's not right.
So I just wanted to add very, very briefly, make this real quick. New York City passed its own very watered down repeal of qualified immunity. But even with that watered down repeal, watered down pullback of qualified immunity, it's having at least in union circles and police circles, they're talking about it, meaning they hate it, and meaning they're putting out memos advising officers to think twice before using force. I mean, it was only like a week after that New York City bill was passed that the union is out here putting out memos telling people basically to not make arrests unless it's clear cut, which is exactly the message that we want out there. So even with the watered down version, it's having some effect. And I'll say in New York too, we're still in the process of educating attorneys about the New York City bill. So it really hasn't kicked in because I don't think enough people know about it yet.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what we're doing here to help spread the word about what's going on and bring some understanding and why we need to do this. So someone asked about the elevator pitch. I guess this would be good if they decide to have a meeting with their legislator. What's the 2 minute, less than 2 minutes elevator pitch for a legislator, why they should get behind this? Who's been up in Albany doing? Kelly, you've been doing lobbying. What when you go in there, what do you say to, like, you see somebody?
I let my leaders do the talking. Yeah, I think a lot of what we said before, like qualified immunity. I mean, explaining it. One of the things that we've learned, and Darlene has taught me this, is that electeds don't know what qualified immunity is. And so education is a huge part of it. Qualified immunity is a near total legal shield from civil liability for public officials, and especially police and correctional officers. It leaves victims and their families without justice or accountability, and ending qualified immunity will allow victims of police brutality and their families to access direct avenues for justice in civil court. And then and a lot of it, as we've mentioned before, is really having people who have been impacted to speak up out of their experiences. And it's one of like the tenets of Vocal New York, is just that, the people who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And it's always important for them to kind of be at the foreground of advocating for this.
Oh, here's a question that Katarina found in the Q&A button. This is for Kelly. Can you explain indemnification and what are the advantages of having the agency pay for LEO liability rather than having the officers themselves be held liable?
Yeah, so LEO means law enforcement officer, just in case folks don't know. So indemnification happens where you sue an officer, they are found liable, and indemnification refers to like who pays it. And so the government actors are indemnified, meaning that the city will pay for it. And and just honestly speaking, this is definitely a cause of conflict even within, our own circles, because, there are those who are like, we want police officers to be on the hook for their abuses. We want correctional officers to be on the hook for their abuses. And I think one of the big things about this movement is really recognizing how systemic these harms are and how we need to have a systemic response to it. And we want to make sure that the family members and people who are impacted actually get the payment that the court determines they're entitled to. And we know that that doesn't happen, all the time if it is the government actors who are actually held financially liable. And so in one real way, it's about making sure the people who are actually abused get what they deserve at the end of the day. And it is also about making sure that we are addressing a systemic problem with systemic solutions. And that requires making the whole system liable, which we know that it is.
If I could just offer a concrete example, my office represents a woman who was sexually assaulted in an upstate prison. She sued under federal law, sued the officer. She won. The jury awarded a sizable amount of money, which was warranted based upon the harms that were caused. And at the back end, the county decided not to indemnify this particular officer under specific county rules that they had. They said it was, the officer's conduct was too wild. We're not gonna cover it. So what does my client have right now? She has a piece of paper that says that she won. and that's all she's got. And I think Kelly was very, very wise to acknowledge that this is not an easy issue. Indemnification is not an easy issue, but the choice was made to eliminate that harm I just described, making sure that if and when someone wins, that has to mean something. And there's some push and pull with it, no doubt, but this is a victim's rights provision. It's making sure that when they win, they actually win. It's not just a piece of paper that they get to wave around. It means something. It's a nest egg to rebuild the rest of their life and pay their bills and get back on the path to healing. So that's just a concrete example of how why indemnification is important in these kinds of schemes.
Thank you both of you for that explanation. This is something this is coming from me. So I was looking up earlier about what QI is, and it said there was a Supreme Court doctrine, not necessarily a law. So this is the Supreme Court legislating from the bench. So we don't really have a law in New York State that says, government officials get this and police officers and correction officers get this. There's nothing in the whatever penal code or whatever that says they get excused, get out of jail free card or whatever you want to call it. So we're looking to pass a law that says, well, this doctrine is no good, can't be used here, etc. Am I understanding it correctly?
Yeah, right now, New York does not, believe it or not, New York does not have a Civil Rights Act similar to the one that Congress passed. So before we can eliminate qualified immunity, we first have to pass a Civil Rights Act, and then with our own Civil Rights Act, say qualified immunity can never be a part of it. So we're like, we're taking the good parts of the federal law and we're eliminating the parts that federal courts have written into it. So qualified immunity we'll leave that behind with the federal courts. We're going to take from the federal courts and from federal law. We're going to take the good parts of the federal civil rights statute. So things like making sure that you can sue and recover for violations of your constitutional rights, that you can sue for injunctions to make changes. Not just about money, to actually make changes. Having attorney's fees be awarded at the back end when someone wins, which would incentivize a whole army of lawyers to want to bring these cases if they know that at the back end the government's going to pay them for every hour that they worked on the case. So it's about taking those good things in the federal law, using them, but also just saying, all right, we don't need to take the entire law. We're just going to take the good parts and we're going to just build it from there. So all the good parts of the Federal Civil Rights Act and eliminating all the barriers to justice that the federal courts have put onto it.
It's kind of interesting that I think I make an assumption that New York would have like its own version of the Civil Rights Act, I guess, and we just left it for the federal government to take care of that. So I think I'd get behind that, definitely. So I'd love to see us do that here in New York. It seems more often we need to do stuff on the state level to protect ourselves from the shenanigans that sometimes go on in the federal level. So, okay, I'm not seeing any more questions, or let me see. Anyone else? Ellie Mistel talks about, okay. So yeah, I don't see any more questions. So we're at the hour, 8:05. All right, we did exactly an hour. This is great. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Kelly and Darlene and Robert and Vocal for coming in on this and helping us. Vocal New York is great. You got to come out to Long Island, where I am. Establish a chapter there. We need you. Appreciate everybody being here tonight. And we'll have a follow-up email for everyone with actions. Tweet, text, tell your friends and neighbors. Get this out there because it is March 10th. We have 3 months. 3 months to get this done. And I think we can do it as long as we all take an action. So don't go watch your Disney Plus tonight. Go take an action, call a friend, and then do it. Get 3 people to send that text to resist bots. That's your homework, everybody. 3 people to send that out tonight. And then, you know, I'll check up on you tomorrow. So, all right, everyone, thank you. If any closing words from anyone, you're welcome to say that. You know.
I would just say, you know, thank you everyone for coming tonight. You know, it's really all about education. So please, you know, hopefully everyone's learned something today about qualified immunity. If you have any other questions, we are always open to answer any questions that you might have. And, you know, please tell your friends about it, you know, discuss it with, you know, people that you know, because it's unfortunate that a lot of people don't know what qualified immunity is. And you don't want to wait until it actually affects you, really affects you personally, to find out what it's all about, because then it will be too late.
You're right. All right. Well, with that, thank you again, everyone. Be well, stay safe, and have a great night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.